Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan
you gotta be confident about your Achilles when you
Chase
show up.
Thornton,
Yeah, I mean, I got him at
Chris
Caring
Dowhouse,
about these appointments in fantasy in the sense
and Adam LaRue. Don't hope to win. Be great and dominate.
Hello. We are back with the second hour for Operation Domination. Excited to keep talking about some of our favorite draft prospects. As we mentioned in the last hour, which ended up being 2 hours. We have it written down as being hour 1 and hour 2, but you know how it goes. We're really excited for the draft, and I know for Chris and I, this is like a holiday functionally. Like we're approaching. It's draft eve and we are approaching draft day, so really excited. So it's one of those where we try to keep it closer to an hour, but this is one of those times where I certainly don't mind making the exception, and I don't think Chris does either. These are fun things to talk about, so excited to get it after it. For those who maybe didn't check out the first hour, which if you haven't, you should go back and listen to it. Real quick, before we get too deep into the weeds on what we want to talk about today, what are your what's your process for evaluating some of these players, and what do you value the most in some of these positions?
So ultimately, I'm looking for guys who are going to contribute, of course, guys who are going to kind of graded as whether you're a contributor or a starter, and then looking for guys that have upside. And how I kind of judge upside is, do you do things that are really well that stand out? So if you're good in your left tackle, for example, do you have good feet? Can you pass protect? And then I want the size. Well, I don't always knock you. You don't always have 33-inch arms from the Will Campbell story, for example. It does matter if I can see guys get into your body. It does matter about certain things where I can see potentially if you have longer wingspans or you're a taller, bigger guy, the domination factor can be something that we talk about Operation Domination. I'm looking for guys who can dominate. So quite often I'll err with some of the guys that maybe I think physically have the dominating characteristics. Now, I don't necessarily always just put those over everything else, because the other thing I value above that is production. So like a Shamar Stewart, for example, we talked about the first show, is a guy that, people are talking about, look at the athleticism, and I struggle with him having a grade as high as they do because I don't see the potential that he's going to produce. Yeah, you're an athlete, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're a good football player. So I do think it all kind of, goes together. I like guys that are athletic. I like guys that are usually bigger, stronger, faster. But I'm always going to look for guys who do things really well, such as do you run routes, do you do the things that matter in the NFL between the guys who produce versus the guys who sit the bench.
Yeah, 100% agreed. I think that as I've evaluated more and more drafts, and I'm curious if this is the same for you, but I've seen myself just grading the safe picks a lot higher, and the guy, I'm just going to let everyone else over-exaggerate the guys that have all this potential but just haven't really produced yet. That's just not my wheelhouse. Not to say that I don't project guys at all. There's certainly a balance in finding the things, valuing athleticism and going, this guy can be this, but I'm curious, how much are you drafting guys at what they can be in the NFL, and how much are you drafting guys for what are you day one going into your first season?
Absolutely. And to that point, Adam, I'm watching guys that jump out to me. Quite often we'll find out measurables and combine stuff later down the road in this process. But we talked about, I'm looking at guys throughout the season, and a lot of times when you watch a game, you see the guys who just jump out. Maybe they don't have that great 40 speed, but football speed wise or on the field speed, you see that receivers, the guys who get separation, or guys who are able to use their changes speeds to get open. So there's a lot of things that I'm looking for outside just guys who could just run fast and jump high.
That's something that's always it kind of relates to something funny that I'll try to do sometimes. If I haven't watched a player, say that I hear from someone else about a player and I add them to my watch list and I start watching them, what I try to do is I won't look up their number first, and I'm just I'll watch the tape, watch a few plays, and see if there's a guy that pops, without knowing who obviously if I've watched the team already, then that's one thing. But like if it's, like when I went to Darius Alexander for Toledo, for instance, I was like, all right, no, I'm watching a 3 tech. I'm just going to let the tape play for a little bit. If the guy that jumps off the screen is the guy that I'm supposed to be watching, then that's obviously a really, really good sign. And of course, then like, there's not another guy jumping off the tape from Toledo. But you get the point, right? Where it's like if a guy pops off immediately, there's no name value attached. There's no like, oh, other people think really highly of him. It's just like that guy's a guy. Then you certainly you get really excited.
Let me ask you one thing, Adam, and this isn't necessarily in our outline. We'll get to it in a second, but this is definitely something that stood out to me. We talked about last show, some things, how this draft stands out to us. When you look at this draft, do you feel like there's a lot more, what's we're looking for, more projection kind of needed for guys where you're looking at guys and you're trying to figure out, we talked about we don't necessarily know what they're always going to be, but do you find yourself trying to figure out more, I don't want to say reaches, but you're trying to figure out more potential in this draft with the guys who stayed as long as they have versus the guys who maybe accomplished something in their sophomore, junior, or are a legit senior. With the whole COVID thing, I feel like it was for myself. It was really hard to kind of evaluate where you really are if you've been a 5th year, a 6th year, because a lot of those guys like suddenly have way better numbers or suddenly kind of burst or look. We talked about jumping out. They do jump out because they're men and they're playing against guys who aren't quite men yet. So did you have any kind of concerns when you went through the draft trying to project some of these guys based off of how COVID and some of the guys, with the whole licensing thing where guys are staying 4, 5, 6 years now in college and, how that kind of projects when you watch the tape?
Yeah, I like to take it like a case-by-case basis. Like, why were you staying? And, what's the athleticism like? Because at a certain level, like the linebacker that we talked about in the first hour, Demetrius
Knight
is,
from
like,
South Carolina.
of that. Yeah, he's someone where to me, like, I definitely glad that he got the testing that he did because it kind of solidifies in my mind that like regardless of like maybe you were beating up on some teenagers a little bit, but at the same instance like you are testing wise an NFL athlete and like any real capacity that like we're gonna discuss, like any drill. I feel like in the circuit you look like an NFL player, like you belong. So to me, it's like, how much do you belong? What are these traits? And you better be like ready immediately. Like you can't be a project and old. I'm willing to draft. Like there's an upper bar, right? Like I'm not going to be taking Brandon Wheaton in the first round personally, but within reason, like I can draft an older prospect and still feel pretty good as long as like to me. Let me put it this way. To me, if it's a question of like, oh, I'd really want to re-sign you, but you're old at the end of your rookie contract, then that still means the pick hit because I want to re-sign you, right? Like, I'd much rather that than one of these project players at the end of the first where it's like, okay, I'm drafting you because I'm getting this 5th-year option, but like to me, if I want to do the 5th-year option instead of just re-signing you, then to me that pick failed. Like, you should be already like sold on the player by that point. So I'm looking for guys who pretty quickly out of the gate are going to be hopefully impact players.
Yeah, it's just curious. Like I said, some of these guys when you're your 5th year, 6th year quarterback, it does get easier. You are able to do things better. Receiver, you see guys get better packages. A guy that I like a lot, we're talking about as we go through our positional guys. I like Kyle Williams a lot, for example, from Washington State. But I also like Kyle Williams in his 5th year when he truly took off. He's always been pretty good. Now he's exploded this year, but could that part of that be that you've worked on some of your skill set and now you have 5 years on that? So definitely curious what you thought, Adam. And we'll kind of go through positions now if you want to kind of start off some of the things, talk about trenches, and maybe some of the guys that you want to pound the board for, pound the table for, over or against.
Yeah,
let's just talk about what you got.
So looking through the trenches, I want to see, find some spots that we can pick at. I mean, I'll bring it up again. Gray Zabel, I think at guard. To me, like here's my sneaky piece. I not only have moved Will Campbell inside to guard in theory. Like I don't, maybe right tackle's fine. I don't disagree there, but I certainly don't want him at left tackle personally. Not only that, like at guard, I prefer Gray Zabel. Um, so that would be one where I think the consensus is that due to the arms, you potentially kick in Will Campbell, but that he's the best lineman available. I don't even necessarily disagree there. I not only prefer Josh Simmons, but also at guard, I would prefer Gray Zabel.
Well, Adam, why don't you go ahead and go through some of your interior, like, give me some of the guys that you have at your tackle and interior lines as guys who, kind of start with some of the guys who you think are going to be actually, produce at NFL level, and then kind of work your way to the guys you think is higher tier guys.
Yeah, I mean, at tackle, I mean, we kind of went through it in the last show, right? Like, I think Josh Simmons is a rock star. I think Kelvin Banks Jr. Can be a really solid left tackle for you. And Membu is someone who at right tackle or guard I'm really happy about. Will Campbell is technically my next guy at tackle, but someone who I, again, would much prefer to be kicking inside. Right tackle is fine. I just, for me, like, I didn't think that he necessarily overcomes the length issues. My next guy after that is Connerly. Before I have a bit of a fall off, he's someone who we didn't talk about in the last show, but I really liked, especially as a pass blocker. I think he's got a lot of energy. I think he's got really good feet. I did have some worries about his play strength and his anchor, but still someone who, the quickness, the hands, I did overall really like. He was more of like a second round type of grade. At guard, like I said, like Zabel a lot. Campbell, it would be next. Wyatt Milam. I have Donovan Jackson, which I think is right about a consensus, but the guy that I probably have higher than most people is right there with Donovan Jackson. I have Tate Ratledge. He's someone who I thought looked fantastic as an athlete, and I think that lateral quickness was the biggest part of it. He's another guy like Milam, where I think as far as these guard prospects are amongst the best pass protectors, and right there with Zabel as well. Someone who I wish, admittedly, he was a bit more of a finisher, and I definitely think he's a guard through and through. I don't see a center, and I don't see a tackle. But otherwise, like, I just think he moves so well. And I think he's already a pretty good pass blocker, but I think at least in a zone scheme, you can develop him into a much better run blocker. And he's someone who I don't think he's a liability as far as his play strength, although it could be better. But someone who not quite a first round grade, but I think I had him, in the like 30s, 40s area.
Who was this, Adam?
Ratledge. Yeah.
Okay, Ratledge. I do like Tate Ratledge. I have him as my number 10 guard. I do like Tate Ratledge.
I have him at 5, so nothing too crazy. I have Fairchild next to guard, and then I have a drop off personally to Marcus and Bo in the next group. And then at center, I wasn't super in love with the center class, but I talked about Jared Wilson, who I really like. And then I think Jake Majors is someone who I think was a really smart center. I worried about the traits at times, but he's someone who I feel like at worst is a high-end backup, but could also very well be someone who I don't know that he's ever going to be like a difference maker for you, but I think his floor is super high at the position just because I think he's a pretty solid technician, and I think he's a hustler. And I saw Seth McLaughlin pretty similar, and I have Monheim right there with that group.
I like that. So for your guards and your centers, like how deep do you have like guys starters or guys who could be starters down the road? How far deep do you have for each position? Kind of who are some of your cutoff guys?
Center, I really only had like 4. That 4. With the exception of you talked about, I think it was Zabel moving in. I would agree with you. I think he's a day one started there. At guard, I definitely went a lot deeper. I would say for me, all the way down to so after that first group, I go to Fairchild, then Marcus and Bo, and then this is where I have and this is a big asterisk for me, and he's someone who a key point like at the end of the last show. I have Tyler Booker here. He's someone who, in a straight up downhill power scheme, I think he's way higher than this. Like I don't want to get it like too crazy. He's just to me, the majority of the league is not built that way right now. So I have him a little bit lower than consensus because in theory, I don't disagree with the talent. I just don't I don't think he's the best player at guard for most teams in the NFL right now. There are a select few teams like the Ravens, for instance, where I think he is very good. I just think unless you're built like a physical team, then I don't see the point. But he is someone who I think on those physical teams is a starter. And then I was actually more impressed than I expected to be out of Miles Frazier. He's someone that I think kind of similar to what I talked about with Jake Majors. I don't think the upside is crazy high with him, but he's someone who I definitely see as someone who could be a low floor smart starter at the guard position.
I like it. So for myself, I go pretty deep at both as well. I did kind of cheat a little bit when it comes to center, where a lot of the guys I'm listening to where a lot of teams are talking about projecting moving to them, or some teams have projected moving to them, so there are a little bit more talent pool. I have Zabel be number one center on my board. If you guys play, I do as a guard. I have him as my number 7 guard. I have a lot of things I do like about him, but we're talking about some of the guys I think they're going to kick inside, and I think will be better at. Wilson is my second guy. I think Wilson's good. I talked about Jonah Monheim before from USC. Joshua Gray's a guy that I think could play in the NFL. Drew Kendall's a Boston College guy, a little undersized with strong wrestling background. I think he's a legit center. Jake Major talked about having my number 6. Jackson Slade for Sacramento State, guy who plays a lot of guard tackle. I think is going to be a center, a guy who's got good athleticism. Seth McLaughlin, number 8. Eli Cox is a guy who I think could play center or guard. A lot of talk about he could play center. I like his as a center. What I like about him most is that he can be very physical. One of those guys who's a mauler in a sense. And then I think Cooper Mays and Gus Hartwick can actually play center as well. My wild card at center is Willie Lampkin, a guy who played guard for UNC, had high PFF grade, was 270 pounds playing offensive line, up to 290 now. He does a lot of things well. He can kind of continue to kind of beef himself up. He might be a surprise guy that we saw Jason Kelsey have a great career for the Eagles as an undersized center. This could be another guy who wants up being an undersized center down the road that I think you can keep your eye on. A lot of the guards you talked about, Adam, I agree with you, most of them. The difference for me is I have Membu. If he was my guard, I'd have him as my number 1 guard. I think he'd be an absolute stud as a guard. Donovan Jackson, if we're not going to move Membu inside, is my top guard. I actually have Donovan Jackson inside my top 15 on my big board about for our last show. I'm number 13 on my board. I have below him is Tyler Booker, number 14 on my board, and my third guard. Look, I agree with you about Tyler Booker not having to fit. And how I knocked him at him is he's not in my top 5. That's how I knocked him. I agree that he's not everybody's preference, doesn't fit everybody's scheme in a sense. But where I find a guy that outside that particular thing, as a guy who's a mauler and a tone setter, who I think could just be reminding a lot of Nelson for the Colts and what he kind of brought to you guys, he's a great pass protector. And I think people overlook that. It's very rare you find guys who can maul like he does and be as good in the running game as they can be, but also a fantastic pass protector. And I love that ability. I think you talk about Baltimore, a great fit for him. Detroit, to me, would be an absolute stud fit for him as well. We'll talk about some of our home run fits later on in our show. But that's a guy that I definitely think is extremely talented and going to be a game changer. Will Campbell, my 4th. I also have Will Campbell as my 4th tackle. We'll get to tackles in a second. I'm going to kick in. If I had Banks as a guard, I have him at 5. I have Jonah Savina. I'm saying it wrong. Savariana from Arizona. He plays tackle. I think he could play right tackle, but I think he'd be way better served as a guard as well. You talked about Zabel. You talked about Millam, White Millam. He's a guy I've struggled with where his pass protection is off the chain as a tackle, and I see a lot of his tackle tendencies come out, and they're saying he's having a little hard transition being a guard because he's not a guy who naturally gets low. I think he'll be effective at him as a guard. I would have him much higher if I was more confident because I love what I see pass protection wise. I'm just worried that he might struggle a little bit with that conversion because not everybody can just do it. Like everybody thinks, hey, tackles to kick inside. It's not always that simple and that easy. And then rounding out, I think Membao is a guy who definitely could play. Tate Rutledge I have as my 10. And then ending where guys I think can play, I have Charles Grant as a guard. I don't think he can play tackle, but I think he could be a guard from William Mary, Frazier, Fairchild, Emory Jones, all guys who I think can start from day one. And Luke Kendra I'll throw in that mix as well. So I think overall this interior is where I see a lot of strength in this draft in particular.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to that point, like, it's an interesting interior group because there's a lot of guys who are kicking in, but only, like, that doesn't work for every single guy. So there is only so many of these guys where it's going to, end up working, and you can kind of isolate the ones that we think will work based on their ability to get low and their body control, but at the end of the day, it's just going to click for some and not for others. So it makes it at least an interesting group.
Well, I'll give you another one, like, for example of that. I think that people have Conley kicking in a lot sometimes at guard, and I just don't see him playing guard. I think he's much better served as a tackle. I think he needs to kind of get stronger. You talked about last show or earlier, but I think Conley, to me, is a guy that I like more so as a tackle prospect than I would like as a guard prospect.
Yeah. A guy who I really went back and forth on, speaking of like that switch, was Cameron Williams. I really struggled because I felt like he's someone who gets beat in the ways like I want to move a tackle in, but at the same time I was really struggling with the footwork and the getting low as someone that I could potentially kick in. And it's someone who I thought had the frame and the play strength to potentially be really good, but I just couldn't. I really struggled to find a fit for him, whether he kicked in or not. I think maybe he could be a guard in a straight-up downhill scheme, but I just don't think he has the lateral ability to do much else. But he is physically, like, I think he has an NFL type of frame, but he's not built like a tackle. He has tackle arms. Like, the length is fine, but he just feels very, like, thick instead of that, like, length that I would, look for more at tackle. Like, he was a weird one for me.
So I get what you're saying. He reminds me. We'll get to definitely should talk about the tackles. He reminds me of a guy who would be good in Cincinnati or maybe Tennessee, where those guys they like the bigger tackles, the guys who don't necessarily look as smooth in pass protection. What I like about Cameron Williams, I have number 10 in my tackle. I think he's moldable, Adam. I do like the length. I don't think he's a guard. I didn't project him as a guard because I'm with you. I don't see his movement or his ability. That's where he's going to shine. I think where he could shine is he could definitely be a right tackle down the road if I think you put some work into him, and possibly left tackle because I do see some things that I like characteristic-wise where his length, he's got a good fit for how big he is too. So there are some things I like about where his potential down the road. I have him as a guy that I think is a bit of a project, so I have him at 10 in tackle. But I agree with you. I don't think he's a guy that I think people might, because of the size, one movement. I think he's much better served to stay at tackle personally.
Yeah, that's where I ultimately ended up, but I flip-flopped a little bit because I just really struggled with him getting beat to the outside, but he's someone who, the frame is there, so.
Well, in a similar, mindset in the sense for myself was Arizona. Like I said, I'm keep messing his name. The Jonah kid, he's got the good size. He doesn't necessarily play physical all the time. I think he'd be a quality right tackle. I think he could be a Pro Bowler, a good, really good guard. So that's why I project him more as a guard. But I think he can play right tackle. I just don't think I do have concerns about when it comes to pass protection and his strength. But he was a guy that I can see similar where I struggled more so with him. We were like, okay, I can see you doing both. I can see some of the holes in both for you. Which one would I stick you at? I actually have him similar on both my boards where he winds up being like I think 8 or 9 as both a tackle and a guard. But I like him more so as a guard because I think he has way more upside there.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel you. I agree on the upside. He's someone who I definitely liked, but I think you have to kick in. Tell me about Charles Grant. He's someone who I haven't heard a ton about getting kicked in. Like I've heard some teams like looking at it, but I think I like him as a tackle, probably more of a right. But tell me about kicking him in.
Yeah, well, so he kind of bulked up a little, but he was around a little under 300 pounds, and during the process, put him up 311 now. some of the things that kind of came up, he does have shorter arms, and people wanted to they look at some of the competition. You did go to William Mary. Now he dominated a verse that had great PFF grades, but the agility, the mobility, I think people are kind of seeing that might translate better as a guard. For me personally, what I think he struggled with, I think he's going to struggle with some of the guys who have longer arms in the NFL that can get their hands on them. I think he's going to struggle with some of the speed rushers, where I think as a guard, he can get away with some of the things and that he might struggle with when it comes to physical strength. And I think that he's going to be really good in a zone scheme. You look at him, put him like in a Miami, or put him in the 49ers, put him some other teams. A lot of things you saw from Dominic Pooney do for the 49ers, for example, he was a right guard, he was a right tackle, played some left tackle, played some guard when he was in Kansas, but he had that kind of good footwork, he's where he's supposed to be, willing the maul. Grant is definitely willing the maul. So I think there's things that were I had questions about how he translated as a tackle in the next level. Maybe some other teams started talking about that as well, where they started floating the idea of moving him into guard, especially with the size and the arms length.
Yeah, understandable. To me, I thought the arms were fine. Like the wingspan's a little small, but I think the arm length itself was fine. But I'm definitely with you as far as like how he moves and you know some of the competition stuff and how well he's going to be able to translate, you know, to getting that outside shoulder attacked at the next level. So, yeah, cool there. What did you have with? I'll ask you one more guy who I've seen both ways. What did you have with Trapilo?
So I have Ozzy at 11. I have him just below Cameron Williams you talked about, because I think Cameron Williams has that tantalizing skill set in a sense, where I think Ozzy's a guy that I think is a definitely bona fide starter, is one of the guys who is definitely good to play left tackle. The length gets into him a little bit, 6'8", a little bit of a problem where he can't always bend, has some struggles with some of the quicker rushers, some of the smaller guys can get into his body underneath him. I worry about his running ability, run blocking. I don't think it's ever going to be a strength of his. So I have some concerns that he's going to be kind of a one-trick pony at left tackle in a sense, where he's going to be a really good pass protector or a solid pass protector. Might have some issues with certain rushers, but I think overall is definitely a starting caliber guy. And I think he's going to be a guy who kind of sneaks up people's boards, where they're going to be like, who's that guy? And he's going to want to bonus second or third round, because you're going to see a run on tackle more than likely at the end of the first round. And you're going to start seeing some of the guys that maybe being pushed up as a result. I think he's one of those guys that you're comfortable with having in your lineup. Might not ever be anything super, but I think a guy who's going to be starting, tackle for the next 7 to 8 years. How about yourself?
Yeah, no, I like him as well. He's someone who, exactly to your point, I think is going to be pretty solid. He's someone who, based on his size, like it does really stink that his arms aren't a little bit longer. But I didn't see that being the biggest issue in the world for him. Like he's again not like an elite level prospect, but certainly someone who I think has a solid floor and is a pretty solid player for the position. Overall, outside of the guys we've already talked about, other guys who I think have at least starter capabilities I'll throw out there are Ariante Ursary, and as a developmental prospect, I really like Holland Pierce out of Rutgers.
I have Pierce as the guy on my list. He's a little bit definitely farther, definitely like the project idea. I think he could be a right tackle, for sure, that down the road. Two questions to that. One, I love Ursay. He's number 5 on my board is my tackles. A guy that I think is criminally underrated. Okay. But question for that, because I'll get to my 6 in a second, which I think might be a little surprising. Wyatt Millenham, I know you talked about on your guard board. What would he be adamant for a tackle? Do you think he could play tackle? Because like you were talking about earlier about Williams, his conversion. I told you I was struggling with his conversion into guard. I don't love him at guard. As a tackle, I think he can do. Like, I think he could be good. Like, I think he's not going to be great or anything like that, but I think he could be a solid tackle and even possibly a solid left tackle. What is kind of your read on him? Because I think he's a guy that people are talking about more and more moving to guard, but as PFF grade was the highest pass protecting grade in this draft, and a guy who did pretty well at West Virginia playing tackle. And like I said, it's been struggling kind of the conversion idea of guard, struggled in the Senior Bowl, struggled in practices as well.
Yeah, he's someone who, like, if he struggles, I'd be happy to kick him out to right tackle especially. I do think he's a really solid player. I think just to me, He's someone who I thought he kind of, you know, struggled getting the outside shoulder attack. I think from a technician standpoint, he was really really good. I just didn't know like um, I think it was they played Penn State, if I'm not mistaken, where I saw him against some higher level competition, and it just wasn't super blown away with his play strength. But I still think he's someone who, kind of to your point, like I think he'd have a long career starting at right tackle. I just don't think that the upside is necessarily there. Where it's like if I can get you to sit low at guard, I would rather do that. But if not, like I think you're a starter at tackle.
So any other guys that you tackle? The guys I teased you with a little bit at number 6, where I have Conley at 7. I have Anthony Belt from NC State at my number 6, a guy who I think could possibly play left tackle. I think definitely be a right tackle. I like Anthony Belton, a guy that kind of reminds me of Ursi in a lot of things, where he's a bigger guy, doesn't have necessarily the bend that people are always looking for, but he gets his hands on you, you're screwed. He's able to run block. He's able to pass pretty big for his size. A guy who I think is going to be one of the better starters possible down the road. So Anthony Belton to me is a guy that I think people are kind of been, different places on different boards, but a guy I think people are overlooking in some senses as a producer at the next level. And I definitely think Anthony Belton could be a solid right tackle, but could be even more than that.
Yeah, I like the right tackle. He's someone who I struggled with as a pass protector. I pretty much see it how you mentioned. Like, I didn't love the footwork, but I agree that like once he has his hands on you, like he does have really strong hands. He does have a really strong upper body, so you can like really control where you're going. He has the frame to play tackle. I think that all worked for me. Like there's no length concerns for me. It was just how well the feet works. But I think he's someone who kind of you mentioned like with Ursary, which like if you can build that player up a little bit, I think he's definitely a good call.
So one of the things that I think is hard, and I definitely understand, is a lot of us as pass protection, we like the guys who can kind of shadow and dance. And I understand that's the easy thing. But I look at like Orlando Brown, for example, who I was higher coming out of the draft than most people were. It was because I realized that you can win different ways. And if you know how to kind of utilize your body the right way and kind of take advantage of what you're good at, sometimes it can kind of, get by or make you look even better than maybe people want to think you are, because even you don't have the greatest technique, or you'll always be where you're supposed to be. You have other things that you can kind of compensate with. And I think that's where I like both Ursay and Belton, where I feel like they're not guys who I was worried about. They're not going to get better as pass protectors, but they're also guys who have seen some good pass protect rushers in their career and stood their own and done well. So I think there's things where I feel like there's a lot of building blocks in place, and I feel like I have more confidence that they can actually continue to grow as that. But I understand the trepidation.
Yeah. For me, the difference was, again, I like both, but for me, like Ursary is someone who, like in terms of like pressures allowed per snap, for example, he's well above average. So even if the feet weren't necessarily great, like to me, very clearly the pass protection production was there. Whereas Belton wasn't bad, but just didn't like there wasn't anything that stood out. I think he's like 48th percentile, so right there in the middle, he's average. Again, not bad, but someone who. It was nice to see for Ursary for me that he was performing at an above average level. Given that he was a little heavy on his feet for the type of tackle that I typically like.
And just to give him a little credit too, he saw a lot of the guys in the Big Ten that are pretty good rushers, but he saw a lot of them one-on-one. He didn't get a lot of help from playing in Minnesota, and that's something I also want to give him credit for.
Yeah, 100%, and for like his size, where it overall fits the bill of a really good tackle. Like doesn't have the longest arms in the world, but I don't think anyone really questions him for it because it seems really clear that he's a tackle.
All right, so going to the other side of this line of scrimmage, is there any guys you kind of want to highlight? Some of your guys from the trenches on the defensive end and defensive tackle, our edge rushers and our penetrators or run stopper kind of guys.
Yeah, we talked about my top 5 edge guys more or less. I don't know that I completely clarified that order, but for me that is Abdul Carter, Mike Green, James Pierce Jr., Ashton Gelati, Josiah Stewart. After that, Nick Scorton. I really like and do think that of the Texas A&M guys, he's kind of where I lean. I have Princely Uman Mayellen.
No, yes, you said it right.
I have him next. I do. Shamar Stewart, I think, is a project, but I do have him as someone who like a worthwhile project. Where I was a little bit less convinced of Stewart or of Turner. Sorry, the Shamars kind of throw me off. I have Donovan Ezeraku right in this group as well. I have Kyle Kennard in this group, and then someone who I really like as someone who I could potentially develop is Oluwafemi Oladejo. I'm really killing it with names today, but someone
UCLA guy.
Yeah, someone who, like Abdul Carter, just switched over from being a stand-up guy at off-ball linebacker, but someone who I thought transitioned his read of the backfield and the run game really, really well. I think he has a lot to learn as far as his hand usage. However, for someone in this first year, I think he is a lot more developed than you'd expect. I didn't think his bend was great, but I thought it was at least average to slightly above average. Thought he had a really good first step. Speed to power wasn't anything to write home about, but a high motor player who I think takes really good angles, gets contained, and I think you can kind of work with that. I think he has the size to be an edge. Obviously, I didn't mention it, but Jalen Walker as an edge would be up there, probably below Pierce. And then the other guy who I'll throw out there. I'm lower than consensus on Michael Williams, but he's someone who certainly, I think the upside for him is way more interesting than Jack Sawyer. But he's in that kind of Stewart and Kennard group as well.
So I'll start off with Michael Williams, the guy that I definitely was with you, Adam, and I kind of flip-flopped him. Who was the guy that you had mentioned with Stewart, where I'm still not as high on Shamar Stewart. I'm a little bit higher than I was, but I'm still very not impressed. Versus Michael Williams, where once I realized he was injured most of last year, and I saw some of the things that I was looking for when it comes to how I think he can translate in his skill set. I don't think he's Travion Walker in a sense, where I think he's got much more refined skills. I definitely pushed him up to. I have him on number 7 now, where I was not nearly as high on him, but I do have him number 7 on my board because I think he's got, of the guys that I think I'm going to reach for potential in this sense, and I haven't seen the production, that's the guy I'm more willing to bet on than the other guys right now, especially off the tape I saw. I think he can definitely set the edge as a run stopper no matter what, but I think the pass rushing will be there as well. And like I said, realizing that he was injured most of last year, it kind of just didn't change my tune of what I saw versus Stewart, who, yes, the scheme has some problems, but I still haven't seen things that really jumped out to me that make me feel like he's going to be something different. A lot of the guys I have with you, my number 1 edge rusher is Jalen Walker. I know that's controversial, people. I think Jalen Walker, like I said, I'm going to keep saying it. I think he's next Micah Parsons. James Pierce Jr. is my number 2, guy whose length, 6'5", 243, can go a little thicker, but pretty good run stopper, pretty good edge setter for his size, and I think he can continue to improve his skill sets. Does a lot of things with the stunting, a lot of the speed rush things that you like, but also a guy, like I said, has how it starts to develop more of a counter, and I like what he can have upside-wise. Mike Green, you talk about how much you love him. I like Mike Green is not necessarily as high as you do, but definitely is one of my highest edge rusher guys. I think Mike Green's an absolute stud. We've seen what he's able to do pass rusher, wise. Reminds me a lot of Elmus Dumerville. People remember him from Denver, a guy who just was able to light up in Louisville, but able to get the edge, consistently dominate with sacks, and that translates in my book. Usually, when you have double-digit sacks back-to-back seasons, you want doing it in pros as well. Abdul Carter, number 4, Nick Scorton at 5. Talked about him last show a little bit. I think he's got upside as a better rusher, but I think he's going to be at least a good run stopper. Giovanni Clowney was my comp for him. Donovan from BCU is the next guy. Michael Williams. We talked about Ashton Gillette before from Louisville. I definitely agree with you on him. The guy I'm high on too. Princely, number 9. Jack Sawyer, have 10. Landon Jackson, my number 11. And I can go down with some guys as far as I think we talked about edge rusher. We talked about like Swinson before, Jared Ivey from Mississippi. David Walker from Central Arkansas. There's a lot of different guys there that might be something. But I like the guy who I like is that lower kind of wild card guy, maybe fifth, sixth, seventh round guy who might definitely surpass that draft capital is Amon Hassan from Boise State. You talked about Gillette and kind of what his skill set he does. This guy's just a solid football player. He's not going to test off the roof, but does a lot of things as a good defensive end and is able to get consistent production the last couple of years. Good size, good length. I like his upside. I think he's going to be one guy that wants to surpassing his draft capital.
Yeah, no, agreed there. Another name I'll throw out there is once you get into the teens, I thought Tyler Barham was pretty good. He's someone who at least hits the production marks, and I was actually surprised by his testing, but it is one of those where it helps him quite a bit. One that I struggled with a lot that I believe you mentioned there was Jared Ivey. I felt like I didn't see any like super great traits as far as I thought he was fairly stiff. He had a good first step, but I didn't feel like it was great. Thought he was fairly solid with the hand usage, but I thought he was pretty reliant on using his shoulder as well. Someone who I thought could generally held contained fairly well, but could get lost, could lose the ball, especially on like options and things. And I was really hoping for more power out of him for his size, and pested relatively poorly. What was your take with Jared Ivey?
So I have him as I think my 16th edge rusher guy. Why I mentioned him is I think he can be a guy that's part of a rotation. I think he can at least be a third rotation guy, if not a starting defensive end. While I'm with you, Adam, I think he's a game changer. I think he's a guy that can get you 6.5 to 7 sacks. A guy that can, with the size, while it wasn't overly impressive athletic-wise, has decent size where I think he could be involved in the running, blocking, and be able to play in different fronts. So war for him is a guy that I think is actual rotational piece, a guy that could possibly be a starter down the road. I agree with you that I don't see a lot of upside or high upside on the guy. So I could see some arguments if you want to take some guys, like the UCLA guy. I should have had my list. I didn't list him on there. I definitely have him over there. I think there's more upside there as a pass rusher moving forward. But is a guy that I think when it comes to can you be a solid player, he's one of the dudes I could say, hey, can you get 6.5, 7 sacks? I think you can. I think you can be a guy that can be, a rotational piece, if not a defensive end too. Probably get overpaid by the Panthers in a couple of years.
Fair enough. All right, looking at defensive tackle, I have Walter Nolan one. Obviously like him a lot. Mason Graham I have next. Darius Alexander, then Derek Harmon, Kenneth Grant, TJ Sanders. I have Deion Walker. There is admittedly a tier gap there, though. I don't want to get you too excited. I know you like Deion Walker. I have JJ. Do you know how to say his last name? I don't even have a clue. Pegues?
Pagoyas.
There we go. Okay. Then I have Riley Mills up in the. I have a pretty this is all well within a tier in a row, admittedly. But I have Riley Mills in this group. I have Omar Norman Lott in this group. CJ West in this group. This is where I have Shamar Turner, Alfred Collins, who I like quite a bit less than consensus, but do think he can be a good player. Tyleik Williams, Neas Peebles, all kind of falling in this group.
I like it. So, Adam, for that part, because my defensive tackle is a little bit different. I have you top 5, but then what I have it kind of separated is based off of the guys that I think can be D tackles or 3 techniques or 5 technique guys, and kind of going from there. Because I understand, not everybody values a run stopper the same way, but I understand that for myself grading purposes, sometimes that run stopper is just as important as a guy that you think could be a twitchy guy on a third down the road. So, I do like your list a lot. And for the Deion Walker thing, I understand that people aren't going to have necessarily where I am with him. But I think that you have a definitely board. What I kind of struggle with, so you mentioned Riley Mills and you mentioned Peebles. Do you think there's 2 guys who are going to be starters? Do you think they're rotational pieces? What do you kind of see their roles particularly Mills, where I definitely struggle with him. I don't have him very high on my defensive tackle board.
Yeah, I think he's a rotational guy, but I think he's someone who, in said rotation, like he was a very productive guy in terms of making big plays. Like his actual overall run defense grade wasn't particularly high, but he had a ton of tackles for loss and he had a ton of big plays behind the line of scrimmage. He's also someone who his pass rush win rate was really high. Someone who I think has he's just like a nifty pass rusher. He has a high motor. He's not someone like his first step wasn't anything spectacular, and he got pushed around in the run game, which is why I think he is a rotational player. But he's someone who, again, I just thought was kind of a nifty pass rusher, and someone who I thought was a pretty smart D tackle.
The other guy I was going to ask you about that I had him higher, and then I realized I think he played at least 5, if not 6 years. Alexander, you talked about you have higher on your board. The guy from Toledo, what stands out for Darius Alexander? You talked about a little bit like his run stopping ability, but what makes him kind of one of the better run stoppers in your book versus maybe a Williams or some of the other guys you mentioned?
Yeah, so I just think the athleticism is there. Like I think he's someone who I want to have a defensive tackle who is really good on one side of the ball but shows the ability or one side of the attack, I guess. Run game or pass game, but shows the ability to get a lot better in the other. So for him, I thought he is right now very good against the run, but he has such an explosive first step that I think that he can translate into a pass rusher. I think the hand fighting needs to get better, but he's just got such a high motor, and he's someone who, despite the hand fighting not being particularly great, and I understand the level of competition, but he did have a really good pass rush win rate. And he did have a ton of plays behind the line of scrimmage, both sacks and tackles for loss. So he's someone who I just think is produced and has the athleticism. So I'm willing to give him some grace in some of the hand fighting and things that he just candidly didn't need to win at the level he was playing at.
I like it. So for myself, I have Derek Harmon, my top defensive tackle, Deion Walker, number 2, Walter Nolan 3, Graham 4, Kenneth Grant 5. To go back to Deion Walker real quick, I know people have concerns, and I do too. The tape this year wasn't that great. He gets stood up. He's 6'7". What's his leverage going to be? But this was a guy who was talked about being a top 5 player going into this year. A guy who had 7.5 sacks in the SEC 2 years ago as a defensive tackle. 6'7", 330. Those guys, his size, his physical ability, his hands, his length, his wingspan, all those things are very rare. And when I always stand out, I look at guys that are game changers, and I look at the Giants, for example, and I look at their defensive tackle situation, and you look at a guy who's just an absolute monster. And I think there's a lot of things that Walker can improve on. I know guys that, for example, like the guy we talked about, Zabel, had some of the better reps. Why he kind of stood out was his reps versus Walker in that Senior Bowl. But as a guy who probably saw everybody's best in a sense, like you're Goliath. Everybody wants to knock down Goliath. Everybody wants to give him their best shot. Everybody wants to kind of give him the best in their all. He's seen a lot of that. He's still 21 and a half years old. I think he's going to want to be a game changer. Talk about a guy that I would love, pound the board. I would love to see him as a Raven moving forward. Walker would be awesome. And I think I'm putting him more on potential, what he can be, versus just purely on the tape, like I said this last year. Nolan, number 3. We already talked about it before. Graham 4. I think he could be a good player, but running like Kyle Williams. Kenneth Grant, Michigan, impresses me a lot. Really athletic, really big. That was the guy we talked about. Those guys I wanted to see a little bit more. I thought Kenneth Grant, for all the skills and athleticism I see, isn't quite flash as much as I would like to see. And that was the kind of guy where I definitely think he's still tantalizing. I still have him 5. Alfred Collins, I have 6. Williams and Caldwell are guys like I have them all grouped together. Guys who are just run stoppers, who I think I can stick you in your early down guy for sure. And then I think maybe you could be more possibly, but definitely early down guy. Some of the pass rushers you talked about, I like Lott, Sanders. The guy I have right around Alexander, and that's kind of why I was asking Alexander, is I have Jordan Phillips right around there from Maryland, a little bit undersized, similar 6'1", similar build, but a guy who's a quick first step, has pretty good hands. I think he could be a guy that could wind up being a pretty good player in the NFL, maybe surprise some people. To thought Peebles, the guy that I'm kind of most curious about is what the hell is his name? I'm gonna draw a blank. But the guy from Florida, Watson, Desmond Watson, 460-pound defensive lineman. Do you think there's any chance, Adam, that he A, gets drafted, and B, actually can do anything in the NFL?
I mean, I think there's a chance. It's hard to project. There's not like a ton of precedent, but
so my role for him, Adam, real quick, is he is the tush push stopper. That's what I drafted him for. But go ahead.
No, I was gonna say he's someone who, I think it's gonna take a creative coach. I think that's a good idea, but someone who, I think there's something there. Like I like to bring him up because it's interesting to talk about some of the more unique players. Some of the there's not a lot of guys you talk about where it's like their style comp is no one, their athleticism comp is no one, right? And he's one of them. So, I think he can, but I do think it's going to take some creativity.
Okay, so that would be my designated tush push stopper. I just put him in out there and say, okay, go for it. So going on to other positions, talk about a little bit linebackers. What are some linebackers and some of the guys? To me, this is the position I feel like was kind of more shallow, where there's a handful of guys that I liked. Not a lot of middle linebackers or inside linebackers that I liked, but there's a couple. But it was definitely a little more slim pickings in my book for this position.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it was pretty shallow. I tend to agree. Like Campbell, really, really good player. I don't think we talked about him much, but have him one. I had Knight 2. I had Sutsman and Paul like neck and neck at 3 and 4. I had Schlesinger at 5. And then this is where like off-ball Jalen Walker comes into play, like somewhere in this ballpark. And then by the time I got down to like the Jeffrey Bosses of the world, I was getting into guys who, in my opinion, are not starting caliber NFL players, or some guys who I necessarily want to be big contributors.
So one of the guys I'm curious that you didn't mention, where would you have Chris Paul Jr. on that list?
Yeah, no, he was the up there with Stutzman and Schlesinger, right in that tier.
Gotcha. So myself, I have Jihad is number 1, and two things with him. Number 1, I didn't necessarily have him as a strictly middle linebacker. I think he has some things to learn as a middle linebacker. But as a off-ball linebacker, I think he would be outstanding from day one. Middle linebacker, he could be one of being Terrell Edmonds, where I think he's always going to have kind of a little bit of a hesitation reaction despite the physical, phenom ability. But you like to pass skills against the pass, I should say. His skills against the pass. You like to build that he can match up. You like to get blitz. He's 244 pounds. But the other thing I wanted to bring up for the second part was there's a lot of talk coming out that he won't be ready for the start of the season and can start off the season on the PUP. Does that change how high you would take him, Adam, and anything on your board? Because I actually did change mine slightly, where I had him in the top 10 originally in my top 100, but I moved him outside the top 10, a little bit concerned with, hey, if you're not going to be there from day one on the PUP, it does get a little nerve-wracking if I don't see you play yet.
Yeah, it does a little bit. I don't think I'd knock him crazy far, but like a handful of spots and the guys who are already right in a tier with you, I definitely don't I don't disagree with that. Like for me, I have him, trying to pull up who I have around him on my actual big board. Like I have him in the ballpark of guys like Armand Bamboo and Wyatt Milam and Banks and Alexander and Jade Barron, who are kind of all in a group there. And I think it does push him down a little bit when it comes to that group.
Having said that, I think Keith Kelly in the linebacker position by himself. So my second is I have Carson Schweiziger, who you seem more down on than I am. I understand the size thing. I don't feel like it's everybody doesn't have any size anymore.
Agreed.
But the other things where I like the production, I like the ability to be able to stick backs out of the backfield to match up with tight ends. He does have good closing speed. He's able to keep people off of him. I like a lot of things that I saw overall. I think he could definitely be starting, if not one of the better linebackers in the NFL. Demetrius Knight, you talked about, I think is definitely a starter from day one, a middle linebacker. I love him as one of the linebackers. Danny Stutzman we talked about earlier, I think could be Jack Campbell possibly. Barrett Carter, I know people get tired of Barrett Carter because he was in colleges, forever it seems like, but he been good, been consistently pretty good. Never necessarily took that level where he's become incredible or anything like that, but a really solid, good all-around good player. I think definitely is a starting linebacker. I think he's going to wind up being underrated in the sense because people kind of forgot about how good he can be. And then Eddie talked about it kind of cuts off for me where I think Boston and Paul can play out a little bit outside linebacker. Maybe early downs, you can put Jack Heiser out there in Notre Dame at middle linebacker. Mondin is the guy that I'm kind of most curious about, where I like the athleticism. I didn't like any production of the tape I really saw at Georgia, but I think he was a high-star recruit, did have good production. I mean, did not have production, but it had good things that kind of, skill sets where you're kind of see he can match up with linebackers, match up with running backs, stronger, bigger guy, good athlete. And then Jay Higgins was the other guy I think could actually play a little bit from Iowa. I think he could be a guy that might be inside, play a little bit outside. I think he's got some versatility and can be a starting linebacker in the NFL. Anything else linebacker-wise, Adam? The linebackers, you talked about Campbell. Are you in the same boat? Like he's in a class by himself in a sense of the linebacker position, or do you have the other guys kind of close with him?
100%. He's my only first-round grade at the linebacker position, and I think it goes from him at like 20-something to Knight at, when did I talk about him? Like right around 50.
Yeah.
It's definitely a bit of a drop-off. And then for me personally, I have Knight kind of alone, but then like another 10, 15 spots. Then I have like I said, that next three of Stutzman, Paul, and Schlesinger, like all really tightly packed together.
All right. So kind of wrapping up defense, look at some of the secondary, Adam. What do you have kind of going on in your secondary and some of the guys that you like, don't like? What's on your board for secondary position?
Yeah, this was a good ranged group. I was excited with them. So CB1 for me is Travis Hunter, but that is including that I get to play him as my like at least fourth or fifth receiver. But he's someone who I just think the ball skills, the instincts are going to translate. I think he's got great hips, but feel very similarly about Will Johnson. He's my number 2, someone who I think is a bona fide outside corner. Not that necessarily worried about scheme fits. I think there's, better or worse teams for him, but I don't think there's bad teams for him. He's really physical. I think he's willing to play dirty. It doesn't necessarily work out for him because of his size, but I don't think he shies away from contact, is what I'll say. Jade Barron, I think, is similar in that vein. I don't think he was not my CB3 as an outside corner, but as someone who I'm playing all throughout my secondary, I do think he kind of fits in this spot here for me, like as far as a draft grade is concerned. And that I thought he was adequate against man. He's produced better at man in college than I think he will in the NFL, because I think the hips are going to be a problem for him. But in zone, I very much so like him, and I think he's really physical, and I think he's got great ball skills. He's someone who constantly is finding a way to knock the ball out of people's hands. I think it's going to be hard to get completions on him again, especially in zone, especially in nickel, and I think his willingness to be physical is going to really help him if he's playing, nickel, or develops into a safety, or wherever you end up playing him. So he's kind of a struggle to place positionally, but I do think that he's a really good player and a first-round talent. I have Darian Porter next. Agreed with kind of what you were talking about a little bit earlier. Really like him, especially as a zone player. I think he plays zone better than anyone in this class is like truly specialized at one thing. I do have questions about his ability to play man early on. I think it can be developed because he's got good hips for his size. He's another corner that I really like. I have Ravel here after him. I think pretty good hips, and I think he's of the specialists. Like, I think he's pretty solid in man. That I felt like was lacking a lot of these guys. I felt like, all right, you're good in zone, you're good in zone, you're good in zone. He's one of the few guys that actually felt like was better in man than zone. He's not great Obviously has the injury. Didn't face the biggest competition in the world. I wish he was a little more physical. He's not someone that I love playing through contact or anything, but I didn't think he was awful or anything. We'll get there. But he had really good ball skills as well. Speaking of awful physicality, I liked Trey Amos in coverage quite a bit, but someone who was not very physical. He's also not someone who has the best ball skills in the world, and his hips, I would say, are above average, but not great. But he's someone who is very versatile in coverage. I thought he was an above average man and zone player, but he's just not going to be a big playmaker for you. He's someone who can be a good CB2. Benjamin Morrison right there, Kobe Bryant right there. Then I have a bit of a drop off into guys like who I still think can play at the NFL level, but guys like Maxwell Harrison, Dorian Strong, Azariah Thomas, Parrish, and Williams, who you mentioned in the last show.
Do you think there's other positions like the safety, secondary, corners? This is one of the deeper positions in this draft in general for like when it comes to guys that are going to be productive in the NFL.
Yeah, I think corner's been a sneaky, deep group, like wide receiver, where I think I probably have a lot more like second and third round grades than most people, but it's one that I don't think is super top heavy. Like I have first round grades on Hunter, Johnson, and Jahdae Barron, and after that, like I have a lot of second and thirds, but I think that there's going to be a lot of quality contributors out of this group.
Definitely agree.
What are your guys?
So for my corner, I have Travis Hunter as my number one. We talked about him in length. Will Johnson, I'm with you on that. I think he could be Marshall Lattimore. I think as long as he's healthy, the idea of what his slide down stock wise doesn't make sense to me. Benjamin Morrison, I think, is a stud, a guy who just needs to be healthy as well. Jahdae Barron is a guy that I have to credit you for turning me more on to, or a guy who I thought was pretty much a nickel guy, just a corner. I like what he could do, ball skills. I think he has the versatility to line up inside, outside as a safety. So I think he's a guy that I have graded. I have on my board both as a corner and as a safety, but I think he could definitely be a starting corner and one of the guys that can be a mismatch. Running a lot of Byron Murphy in the sense where Byron Murphy was able to line up outside and outside. I think that versatility will be key for him, and he could tackle. I think I'm very like the fact that he could tackle. Porter, you talked about, had 83 man grade, 86 zone grade. The completion percentage versus was 29.4%. Guy who only gave up 70 yards the entire season, no touchdown passes. I mean, he's just learning position and has so many things going for him that I think I'm very excited about. Shavon Ravel of East Carolina talked about. I have him and Amos basically hand in hand, and this is how I kind of separate them is basically, what do you prefer? Do you want a guy who's better at man, or do you want a guy who's better at zone? I think even though their grading's a little bit different, I think Amos is better in the zone. I think Revel's better as a man. 6'3". He reminds me a lot of Derek Stingley, a little bit, and where I think he can kind of get better. The statistics show in a sense, and even though he got hurt in East Carolina, there's a lot to like about that kid. Amos from Mississippi, like we talked about, I like his ball skills. I think he's a solid all-around player. And then some of the other guys that I kind of round up where I think they're going to be, upper tier corner starters. I like Maxwell Harrison from Kentucky a lot. I think he's going to be pretty good. But above him, I have Kobe Bryant at 8. Kobe Bryant's a guy that I just like the feistiness. I know he's a little undersized, he's skinny, but the ball skills, he's not afraid. He's gotten picked on. He's been the guy who's been the shutdown. He's kind of played different roles. And I feel like at corner, you got to have that thick skin and you got to be able to want to get better. I like Kobe Bryant a lot as a guy that I think people aren't necessarily as high on maybe as I am. And then kind of rounding up my top 10, I got, like I said, Harrison at 9. Is it Azariah Thomas? I'm messing everybody's name up too. From Florida State, a guy that a lot of people have higher than I do. I like a lot of things on tape. I think he's a little scheme fit. I worry about him getting beaten the deep ball. The athleticism doesn't necessarily overly impress me, so I do have some knocks on him a little bit. Talked Noah Williams before. And some sleeper guys, Darian Strong, Jacob Parrish. There are guys who I think can actually be good starters in the NFL as well. Safety, talked about Watts and Nick from South Carolina, Moray. Jahdae Barron I have as my third safety if he's a safety. Otherwise, I have Mbuka. We talked about him before and why I like him a little bit over Starks, who I have next. Billy Bowman, who I have right behind Starks, I think we talked about a little bit as well, where I think he could do a lot of things that in the nickel and as a safety as well. Jonah Sanker, to me, is one of the guys like I talked about earlier in the last show as a true strong safety. He's going to be more of a run stopper. Isn't necessarily going to be a guy who is a turnover machine, but a guy who can help a lot of things and play as a good, solid player in the back end. Winston Jr. from Penn State, love the range, love the 6'4", love the wingspan. Didn't necessarily have the production I would like, but I think there's a lot of things going for him that he's going to actually be a better NFL player than he was a college player. And to me, it's like I said, this safety class is loaded. I like Castro next. I like Ransom. I like Waller. Even Kid Crawford from Nevada. Caleb Ransall as of a safety as well. I think there's a lot of safeties in this draft that go on up being pretty good players who can actually fill in nickel roles as well. So that's the thing that I've seen kind of evolve over my years of watching NFL is this hybrid safety nickel corner thing where I think there's quite a few options with these guys. And there's a couple guys who actually are old school guys who can fill that strong safety position in this draft as well.
Yeah, I mean, and going with one of those guys, like, I got to ditto what you said on Kevin Winston Jr. He's someone I liked a lot. I think he's one of the best open space tacklers at the safety position. Really, really good. Someone who I would like to see develop in coverage a little bit more, although he was pretty solid in zone. It just wasn't like anything crazy. But like you mentioned, the range, I think if he develops, a little bit more, like it's, reading the offense and develops a little bit more patience, he's going to be really, really good. I think he can over pursue angles a little bit, but like you said, he's just such a good tackler. And like you mentioned, the wingspan, that can kind of come in and save him a little bit. Otherwise, I see it a lot the same as you. The only other guy I mentioned that I liked I liked Mickens quite a bit as well. I think he's someone who all-around coverage was really, really good. I wish he was a bit of a better tackler, admittedly, and the ball skills are kind of so-so, but I just think he's a really good, solid coverage guy, like all around.
That's another good one. Like I said, I stopped naming guys. I still had Trader on my board, Malik Vernon from Iowa State. There's a lot of good safeties in this draft where I agree with you. That's another guy, Adam, that I definitely think is a quality guy that could wind up at least being a rotational piece, if not a starting safety in the NFL.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we talked about this last kind of things a lot throughout, the offseason, where we definitely should go back and check our Operation Domination shows out, where we broke down some of our skill players that we like at the quarterback position, the running back and receiver and tight ends. We did a show for each of those, so definitely go back and check them out. But Adam, just to kind of, over the last 15 minutes or so, let's highlight some of their offensive, the sexy guys in the sense that everybody really cares about. What are some of the guys that maybe you want to talk about and some of the guys that maybe are very different that may make consensus and you want to pound the board for or against?
Yeah, I mean, you've heard me talk about Damian Martinez ad nauseum. I think he's a really, really good runner. I think he's a good athlete. I think that the pass blocking is not great, but I think that can be developed a bit. And I think he's a better receiver than people give him credit for. He's more of a dump-off guy than, an actual receiver, but someone who on said dump-offs isn't that bad. And he's someone who avoids tackles, makes a lot of his own plays. I thought was really good. At receiver, I mean, we both love him and I think could talk about him for a long time, but I just love Jalen Royals so much. He's someone who, if the production matches the tape, I genuinely think that I think he's going to be a stud at the next level. He's got everything I'm really looking for to receiver. Outside of maybe being an inch or two taller, but even then I don't see his height as a limitation. So someone who I like quite a bit.
Do you have a comp for him, Adam, at all?
I don't. I struggle with him. Yeah, do you have a comp that comes to mind?
So I had a couple different guys. So people are going to laugh at me probably the first thing that jumped to my mind because he has number one. And the explosiveness immediately jumped off about tape. He looked like, I was like, Jamar Chase. Now, I don't think he's Jamar Chase, but that's how quickly he jumped off the tape to me, where I could see the explosiveness.
I wasn't going to say it as a comp, but I agree with that sentiment.
And that explosiveness when the ball hits his hands and the ability just to catch the ball and just go with it. I'm like, dude, that's special. I didn't like some of the aspect where I saw Stephon Diggs and some of the things he can do, similar size coming out. I think he can kind of be a good ball, but I didn't feel like it was quite. Then I kind of thought Brandon Ayuk where Brandon Ayuk, when he was coming out, wasn't quite, people thought he was maybe just a short yardage guy, just a long guy, kind of like Jalen was getting pigeonholed as. But you saw Brandon Ayuk was much more than that. So they were kind of some of the three guys I kind of came up with. But what stood out to me, like I said, that jumped out initially to me was explosive-wise was I thought Jamar Chase. And where I realized his competition, of his 15 touchdowns, when you have 7 of your 15 touchdowns or 50 yards or more, that's hard. I don't care what who you're playing against in a sense. Like that's game-changing talent there. And that's a guy that I'm with you, Adam, I think is absolutely tantalizing as a receiver.
Yeah, continuing on, I mean, the tight end episode was fairly recent, but if you haven't seen it already, I really like Oronde Gadsden. I think he's someone who, I think you can fill out his frame. I just really like the length. I think right now he's just a move tight end, but I really do think that he can fill out. He hasn't been a true tight end for the longest time in the world. I think he's got a good combination of hips and lateral movement ability as well as the speed, despite his size. Like, he's not the best mover in the world, but for his size, I think he's pretty good. And someone who I really like how he can catch the ball, especially how he can catch the ball away from his body, high pointing and things. So someone who I like. There's someone at all the positions, I guess, relative to finish it off, relative to draft position. I mean, we talked about it, but I like Tyler Shough. I do think that the tape speaks for itself. I understand the breakout age, but I do think there's a lot of context that goes into it. He's someone who I thought had one of the most consistent throwing motions throughout the tape that I watched, which made the I don't know if you saw the clip of him like whiffing really bad at the I think it was the combine, but that made that so funny because I never felt like in games that was the case, but it is what it is.
I definitely think he's definitely interesting take. The thing I struggle with Tyler Shough is where I see a lot of things that I liked at him. He was a highly touted prospect, so I tried to follow him since he went to Texas Tech and different places. He had transferred forever in college, and I never quite saw those injuries was part of it, but I never quite saw what I was looking for in a sense, where you're this big, strong, you have all the athleticism, and never really kind of materialized quite consistently on the field. And this year it looked like it did, but then I also feel like what happens if you're 2 years older than everybody else at quarterback, you look a little better. But the skill under pressure is what I'm a little worried about. While I think he can do a lot of things if everything's set up well for him, I do wonder, like a lot of people not going to understand for sure under pressure he drifted. Tyler Shough under pressure, his mechanics quickly kind of break down and he quickly kind of drops his eyes. And I don't necessarily think that he always stood in the pocket strongly. So while I like his athleticism and I like his ability to get rid of the ball, there are some concerns about when you actually saw pressure, what did you do with it or how did you handle it? But I do think he's a guy that could wind up surprising a lot of people and wind up by being somebody's, franchise quarterback down the road. How crazy would that be?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely like you think I talked about him in like that 75 range. It's not something that we're gonna get ahead of ourselves, but someone who, like, I don't believe in the ability of Jackson Dart to be a franchise quarterback or Ewers or McCord or Will Howard or any of these guys. I think he's someone who, I don't think the odds favor him being a starting quarterback. Like, I think it's unlikely, but I think he actually has it in him, which I don't feel the same way about some of those other guys. So that's why I do like him quite a bit.
Are there any other guys, Adam, that kind of differ and then when we did our rankings, we kind of stuck to more what we do if they got a chance. We weren't necessarily doing draft capital, but are there any guys that kind of are different as a prospect on your board as where they fall versus what we talk about fantasy wise and where you had them? Like, are any guys higher or lower, or do things translate differently? For example, for myself, I know you took the quarterback. Tyler Shough, I actually have higher, as a fantasy option than I did as a prospect to NFL because I felt like the running thing was more of a thing I tied into it. I understood the more upside fantasy-wise versus I think you're going to be a starting quarterback possibly. That's where – do you have any guys that kind of stand out for you that were maybe a little bit different than you have for what you had for fantasy-wise, ranking-wise?
I mean, I would probably shake the tight ends up a little bit, but I think that's about it. I think quarterback-wise, I'd leave it about as is. But as far as the tight end position, like, I would probably shake up I think I would still leave Gadsden where I have him, to be honest with you, but like that's where the Mason Taylors and Gunnar Helms pass the Fergusons and Elijah Arroyos is when we're talking straight up as NFL prospects.
And how about straight up NFL prospects? Where do you have Jackson Howells? I know a guy that you like at tight end that more of a run blocker. Or would you have him actually as a tight end prospect on your board?
Oh yeah, I think as a tight end prospect, he falls in right after like Gunnar Helm and maybe Joshua Simon. But as a tight end prospect, I prefer him to your Eurosex and Priestcorns and even Conyers, who I like quite a bit. But definitely like Luke Lachey and Evans and those guys.
Definitely agree with that. I know for myself, we talked about some of the guys, receivers and tight ends. I think talk about Royals, Higgins, Jalen Knowles, a guy I think that we can't forget about. The guy that's definitely going to be a Khalil Shakir impact at least in the NFL, if not more, moving forward. Um, the other guys to kind of throw out there, Nick Nash, Isaac Tesla. We talked about those guys in the other shows where I think they're going to be guys later on rounds that, depending on where they wind up being, could be interesting slot fits. And I like that. I think their best football in a sense is still to come for them as receivers. The tight end position, the biggest thing for me, I think, is my separation between Colston Loveland and Elijah Arroyo is little to none. If Arroyo didn't have his injury concerns throughout his time at Miami, I would have him probably over Colston Loveland. I think this guy is going to be, I said it on our show, I think he's going to be Mark Andrews as a tight end. I love what he can bring to the table. As long as he stays healthy, I think he's a legit top receiving tight end. And talk about Gadsden, I still have him higher on my board. I still think he's going to be a game changer. I like the wingspan. I like his willingness to block. Reminds me a lot of Isaiah Likely with that kind of what he brings to the table. And Jackson Hall has talked about a guy I definitely have moving up my board if it's something we're talking about tight ends. I do value blocking tight ends. As a guy I think is definitely a game changer and maybe somebody as a edge setter to today's NFL can be crucial. I think that's a guy that could be an offensive game changer in a way different than we kind of expected it to be in the sense of not catching the ball, but that blocking does help a lot.
Yeah, no doubt.
And then finally, running back, the guys that we talked about for the most part, we talked about ad nauseum. The guys want to kind of shout out. I talked about Royals. That's one of my boys. Bashaw Tootin. I think I have him as my number 4 running back on my board as the guy that I do definitely have in my top 50. I think I have him in top 35. He might not be a starting everyday running back, which I think he could be. But even if he wasn't, he's going to change whatever team he winds up being on. Because you give him 5-6 touches, he can do something. You give him 20 touches, whack the hell out. I love his game-changing ability. I love the sprinter speed. I love the balance. And I think when you talk about a guy who just pops on tape to me, that's a guy who popped on tape to me. But the running back position we know is really, really deep and has a lot of different options. I'm really curious of all the guys that kind of wind up being which happens to Cam Skydaboo is the guy that we talked about in our boards. I have higher than a lot of people. You have higher on your board. I'm very curious to see where he kind of winds up being and where he lands. And then some of the guys that, later on, a lot of like Rashard Smith, for example, a guy who I think is going to mismatch. He might not be necessarily drafted super high, but I think he might wind up being not necessarily Tyrone Tracy as a running back, but actually the receiving threat as well. A guy that is a mismatch weapon, who can go out in the slot, has familiarity playing receiver, and a pretty good running back. Adam, is there any other guys you want to shout out before we get out of here for today? And appreciate all our people listening in for our draft special.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. Thank you for listening. The last 2 guys I'll throw out there are 2 guys who I just think can be solid contributors, and I wouldn't be shocked if they end up in starting roles just if the cards fall right and they end up in good opportunities. And that's Taj Brooks and Jarquez Hunter at the running back position.
Yes,
both of them are guys who I just think are for both of them, I think that they're solid players through and through, can handle all of the things, solid in pass pro, maybe not the best receivers in the world, but can handle it, run well, go where they're supposed to go. They follow their blocks. Maybe not the biggest creators in the world, but just both guys who, again, I think just really solid backs who, if you've got a good offensive line, you just didn't draft crazy high at the position. I think that they can be contributors for you.
I like that. I like that a lot, Adam. Yeah, I mean, you got me when you said Taj Brooks. I'm already excited.
Yes. But all right, I think that's going to cover us off. Again, thank you so much for listening. If you've been listening to our almost 3.5 hours of pre-draft coverage here, if you're excited as we are, I'm sure that you could be listening to this leading up to the draft or coming in to check in on some of the guys your favorite team may have drafted. If you appreciate our fantasy coverage, definitely thank you for coming in to listen. What's up?
Adam, real quick before we cut out for the thing, do you have any fantastic fits that you would absolutely love to see guys wind up in certain spots, or guys that you do not want to see in certain spots where we just be like, I don't want that to happen?
I mean, my in love with is Dante Thornton on the Seahawks. I
I
want him to steal MVS's job with every fiber of my being.
I like that one a lot. I would love to see Jalen Royals on the Texans. I think he would complement what they're missing perfectly and would excel in that offense. That's one of my home run fits that I would think would be awesome to see. Any guys who don't want to see, I think would be horrible. Like, please don't happen. Whether it's as a fan or just you think it would be a bad matchup.
Um, oof. Trying to think. I think one. I mean, I'll just give you a reaction as a Colts fan that I saw. I saw Shamar Stewart to the Colts at 14 today, and wow, that didn't feel very good.
That's what
I've also
Dan's in the same boat for you. Saw the thing for 49ers. He's like, please no, please no.
I've also been seeing the same thing with Loveland at 14 for the Colts, and either situation, I'm not super thrilled personally. So those are two that just as a Colts fan, I'm really struggling with right now.
That would be a tough one. I could definitely see that. I'm struggling with anybody that I like in the offensive position going to the Denver Broncos. I don't want Tet to go there. I don't want Hampton to go there. I don't want Caleb Johnson to go there or Tootin or any of those guys to go to Denver. I want most of the guys that I love not to go to Denver. That's my nightmare matchup. Nightmare landing spots.
That is a good landing spot for I know not
Hal Fadden Jr. I think
say,
could be.
Yeah, that's not a bad landing spot for him.
He would be that Joker. I told Dan that. I gave him credit. I'm not a big Hal Fadden Jr. We talk about him on the show, but I think he'd be excellent in that Joker position for Sean Payton and with Bo Nix checking the ball down.
One last one that I would really love. I mean, if Jaden Higgins falls the way that it's expected for him to fall, I would love for him to be the Patriots' second-round pick.
Ooh, I like it, Adam. I do like that. Him and Drake May would be a nice setup. I like that one a lot.
Yes. That's what I have for fits, at least off the top of my head. Anything else you want to hit?
No, I was just curious to see. Like, I know a lot of times when I'm looking at these guys, when I start doing mock drafts, I start thinking, what do I want to happen? And I start realizing some of these things I'm not super excited about, or some things I would be really excited about.
Yeah, 100%. All right, that'll wrap us up. Again, thank you so much for listening to our pre-draft coverage. I know this isn't our typical. We'll be back to fantasy and doing a dynasty mock draft next week. And obviously, depending on when you're listening to this, if the draft hasn't happened yet, then make sure to go listen to the live show during the draft with Dan and the rest of the Fantasy Sports Advice Network crew, all at a bar in Nashville having a good old time. I'll be drinking.
And Chase the draft, I think. I think he got some credentials to be at the draft himself.
Chase got some credentials for the draft. He's going to be tuning in from there as well, so definitely check in on that. I'll be drinking some Kentucky bourbon in their honor, as I was hoping to go be there with them, but it didn't work out. That's why Chris and I had to go ahead and still talk about some of the guys that we've been watching for a pre-draft show. So, again, thank you so much for listening. And we'll be right back into fantasy football next week.
Hey there. I want to thank you for watching Operation Domination today. And if you're enjoying the show, there are some ways you can help support us. You can go to podchaser.com/Operation Domination and leave us a 5-star review. And you can do this on any podcast platform or on our YouTube page when you go to @FF Advice Network. This completely helps out the show be able to grow, and also leave us comments to let us know how we can curtail the show to you, because you are the most important member of the show. So again, go to podchaser.com/Operation Domination to leave a 5-star review and leave a comment wherever you listen or watch the show, and we'll help better serve you.